Hello, fear seekers, and welcome back to the channel. Have you ever wandered a little too far off the beaten path, only to find yourself face to face with a situation you could scarcely have imagined? Well, these people surely have. Today, we're going to be diving into some creepy, allegedly true, deep woods horror stories. I just wanted to say, I am thrilled with the growth of this channel lately. The positive feedback, the constructive criticism, and even just letting me know what stories you're most interested in hearing next is awesome. I'm starting to recognize more and more of you as you return to the channel, and I really feel like we're starting to build a community. If you have any requests for certain types of stories, please let me know in the comments below. As always, if you have any scary stories from your own life, paranormal or otherwise, feel free to submit them to the email in the description. Now without further ado, sit back, ignore the sound of breaking branches, and get ready to ferment your fears. So, this is going to be a long story, and I know there's going to be a lot of doubt here, but I'm deeply exhausted of keeping this whole story to myself. I've never met someone with an experience like this, not in as much detail and not as strange. I feel really alone and almost crazy, honestly. I very, very much hope that the summer I'm going to speak about was my creative, traumatized mind dreaming or having nightmares. But I can't convince myself of that. I know what happened to me that summer, and I don't know what to do. I've never really discussed this at length with anyone, and I've been holding in a lot, for a long time. Basically, there is something evil in the woods that surround my grandfather's land. I've inherited it all, and I'm too terrified to go back. I live in Nova Scotia, Canada. I live in the capital city of that province now, but as a kid I was raised in the sticks, out in the woods, and mostly I was by myself. I know forests and I know what's normal, and there is something living in my grandfather's woods that is not normal. I'm too chicken to find out what it is. My grandfather Philip, I call him Puppy, but everyone else called him Phil, died 2 years ago last January, just after his 73rd birthday. He had been in a care home for the last 3 years, but the last few months were the hardest. My grandfather was my best friend when I was a little boy. He was a huge man, with a big red nose, no hair, and brilliant sapphire blue eyes. He dressed well, and loved the color pink. He constantly wore pink and even painted the inside of his house, which he built himself, pink. Really, he wasn't my blood grandfather. That was Duncan, who took his own life in '74. I never met Duncan, but he's not really a part of that story. My grandmother Emma met Philip as a young widow. She didn't know anything about him. She soon learned that he was intelligent, a brother to 4 younger siblings, and owned a lot of property outside of a small village in a different part of Nova Scotia. He made money by working for the town, digging and paving roads and the like. He and my Nan, a fiery chick with no time for anything she didn't want, hit it off. She had 3 kids with her dead husband, my mother and my 2 uncles. Philip was good with the kids, but never, ever let them come around his place. Only Nan was allowed, until I was born. I was born in '92, and I was had out of spite, but my grandfather loved me, for some reason, and treated me like I was his own kid. He constantly paid attention to me. He was really one of only 2 people that actually cared for me as a kid. My mother was negligent and self-involved, constantly passing me off to other people, other family members. I barely remember a good exchange with my mother as a child. I really only remember playing in the woods. My grandfather and my grandmother never married, and my grandfather never had any marriages before that, nor any children. Once in a while, myself and my grandmother would make the hour or so long drive to go spend the day at my grandfather's place. He owned a huge chunk of family land, not unlike my family's own, just not on the coast. It was off of a winding river that the nearest village was named after. It was family land. However, the original family home had been swallowed up by a massive flood after my grandfather inherited it as a young man. The family home is still presently underwater, having collapsed long before I ever had a chance to see it. Instead, my granddad built a new home and a few maintenance properties around it. He left the new lake where it stood, let the old homestead fall into the water, and never spoke about it. When I stayed with my grandfather for visits, he would teach me things. Lots of useful, down-home things. How to plant and grow veggies. What kinds of things were edible from the forest. How to boil water and clean it. What tracks meant what kind of animals were near. That the sound of foxes and coyotes across the lake were nothing to fear. What kind of trees were around us. How to raise chickens and pigs for food, and treat them with respect. Things like that. Just wisdom. But he also taught me that birch trees scream when the wind blows, and if I were to hear that steady, gut-wrenching shriek, and the wind wasn't blowing, to go home, right away. That the smell of rotting meat generally meant danger and to not walk off the trail. Also to never stay out past dark, especially if I were near the camp, or on the surrounding trail. That the old, rusty scythe in the oak tree, so old that it had grown into the branches and fused there, unmoving and vaguely threatening, was for protection. I'm going to supply some Google satellite images, as before there were none of the area. I've outlined a lot of them, to help with my explanation of the summer I was 7 years old. This is the main property. My grandfather owned all of the woods between the roads that you see there, as well as a lot of the acres surrounding. Notice the lack of other buildings and trails. It's all woods. This will give you a better idea of the visible surrounding area. The neighbors outlined in yellow were always strangers to me. I never knew the constant revolving door of people that rented the property. No one ever stayed more than a few months. I remember several of them losing dogs and cats over the years. Pets had a hard time surviving there. Often you would find the dogs after the coyotes got to them, sometimes left in trees or on doorsteps, sometimes in the backs of the cars in my grandfather's car graveyard. The blue property was that of my grandfather's only nephew, Kenneth, spelled wrongly in a charming example of country illiteracy. Kenneth was a very normal guy with a wife that was an elementary school teacher a few towns over. They weren't often home, as they had no children. This is my grandfather's property proper, including his home. This is the walking trail that I would often follow to reach the camp, which was off of the main property. This is the camp property, including the pet graveyard. The summer I turned 7 years old, 98, my mother decided to drive out to my grandfather's without asking if he was there. She'd never been to the property and didn't know the way. I remember her getting lost several times trying to find the McKay Road. She finally arrived, and I remember my grandfather being completely startled by us appearing at his home. I had never been there without my grandmother. And, as it turned out, she was out of town and unable to come down to look after me, but, once again, my mother wouldn't take no for an answer, and left me with my granddad without much of a second thought. Night was falling, and my grandfather was nervous, is the only way I could describe it. It was a remarkably still summer night, but he was agitated, chasing the chickens into the barn they stayed in, making sure the cats were locked in the shop with the yearling pig we'd been raising. I watched him through the mudroom window, standing on tiptoes to watch him stop to occasionally draw a kerchief against his forehead, sweating in the dull, thick summer heat. I remember the rising cries of the peeper and bullfrogs from the lake. We were so close that often they became cacophonous and really the only thing you could hear. That summer, with the clean air, they were particularly loud. I loved that sound more than I can ever admit. It still brings back good memories. Finally, a little before full dark, he came in and made us a small dinner of venison and potatoes. We went to bed shortly after that. I thought it was strange because usually he and I would stay up to watch old westerns or something on the television, but he explained that he was tired and early nights are good for people, so I went to the spare room. The house he built had been simple, one floor with a crawl space and no attic. There were really only 5 rooms in total. A mud room with a large washing tub and the icebox. It held the only door to the outside. It opened into the kitchen, and that led into an open-concept living room. Just up from the kitchen and attached was his bedroom, then a small bathroom and the spare room, almost in a T shape with the bathroom at the axis of the T and the bedrooms on either end of the top stroke. There were a few windows, one of which was in his room, facing the front porch, and another that was just above the head of the bed in the spare room, with another along the bed's left flank. I laid in that familiar bed in the loud silence of the croaking and twiping frogs, roaring through the open, screened windows, and finally fell asleep. It was in the early morning, 2:48 exactly, because from my assumed vantage point I would see the clock blaring down on us. I don't know what happened first. I think I was still waking up, so I became aware of 2 things at once. One, that my grandfather was yanking me off the bed and onto the wood floor alongside the left side of the bed, or 2, that someone was knocking incessantly on the door. My grandfather was huge compared to me, and he laid down basically on top of me and put his huge, calloused hand over my mouth and hushed me with the other. I remember how pale he looked in the moonlight. His eyes were dinner plates, and he looked very much like a frightened child. It was then that I realized the frogs had gone silent. The knocking continued. Loud. Very incessant. Done in a pattern of 3s with short, impatient pauses in between. Then, I heard a voice, very hauntingly calm and distant, coming from the front of the tiny house. "Philip." I looked at my grandfather. Utterly no one called him Philip. Everyone called him Phil. He hated being called Philip, right up until he passed. "Philip, it's me, your nephew, Kenneth." That's when I started to get very, very frightened. I never really knew fear like that, but hearing that voice, that weirdly clear, emotionless voice call my grandfather by that wrong name and then tell us that it was his nephew Kenneth? Kenneth, with the jolly face and the booming country voice and the charmingly misspelled name. Whatever it was then knocked on the house itself. I could hear it tap the glass of my grandfather's bedroom window, once again calling for him in that clean, crystal voice. "Philip, it's me, Kenneth, your nephew. Let me in." I heard the, whatever it was, step down off of the porch after a moment or 2 and start walking, following the side of the house. My grandfather held his breath, pressing down harder over top of me and covering most of my eyes with his palm, hushing me again. I could barely see the blue of the screen above me, but I could hear perfectly well. It walked, a slow, even pace, unhurried completely. However, it did stop, once, at the bathroom window, knocking again. "Philip," it called, then, well, it stopped right against the screen above us. I couldn't see it, but I could see something blocking out the bluish light. I could hear something taking slow, even breaths. Then, something dark pressed against the screen, and I remember being so terrified that I couldn't take a breath. "Philip, I know you're in there. It's me, your nephew. Let me in." We stayed there, in a standoff, For so long my body had bruises from the floor. Us, trapped on the ground, and it, standing against the screen. Finally, after so long I got dizzy from holding my breath, it just left, leading that even, easy pace back against the side of the house and then out, gone as quickly and as without warning as it came. My grandfather waited a while longer, and then slowly, cautiously stood up and put me back into bed. He didn't say a word, but closed the window before returning to sit in the darkness of the kitchen. Slowly, the sound of the frogs came back, and at some point, when the light of morning finally started peeking through the windows, I fell asleep. The next morning I awoke to the sound of the ATV being pulled out of its barn. I got up in a hurry, still sore from being pressed into the floor, and ran for the front door, only to catch my grandfather pulling out of the car park and heading towards the forest trail. He was pulling a small cart behind him and taking things easy. I had plenty of time to see the blue, industrial tarp laying over the back of the cart. I pulled on a pair of boots and went outside, hoping to at least see where he was going, and ended up next to the shop, or barn, I suppose. The big oak where the scythe had been overgrown in its boughs had its roots right beside the thresher, parked beside the barn. I stood beside it. Then, I don't know what really made me look up, but I was met with my pig, the yearling we'd raised, staring blankly down at me from a new perch beside the scythe. My grandfather had butchered the pig, taken its body into the forest, and left just the head in the tree. I didn't scream, but I wanted to. Wanted to so badly I felt my throat compress in stunned, terrified silence. For the next day, my grandfather pretended not to know what I was talking about when I asked where he'd went, and where the pig had gone. He pretended that nothing had happened the night before. We ate lunch and dinner, then went to bed early. That night was uneventful. The next morning, however, I went outside. I think I was still operating on autopilot. As I stepped outside of the door, I didn't quite understand what I was looking at. Below the oak, the one with my pig in it, it looked like someone had left a pile of green leaves. As I stepped closer, it became clearer. The pig's head was gone completely and had been replaced with pale green moth wings. Luna moth wings. Tons of them, but no bodies. Just the loose wings. I'll remember those loose wings laying there, over ankle deep, stacked against the tree with pig's blood still running down its bark for the rest of my life. My grandmother came for me that night. I spent most of that day crying, I remember, just waiting for her. I never went back after that. Never. Not once in almost 20 years. I'm horrified of that place. Utterly mortified. My grandfather died 2 years ago. 3 in January. He gave me the property. I think I'm supposed to go back there. I think I'm supposed to go there and look after whatever came looking for him that night. Anyone, really, with any advice is more than welcome. My name is Isabel, and I live in the Pacific Northwest, in the great, green state of Washington to be exact. One of my New Year's resolutions for 2020 was to lose the extra weight I had accumulated during my first pregnancy, weight that had sapped my confidence and left me feeling kinda dumpy. My husband always told me he didn't mind, that he loved me no matter what, but I minded. It might sound a little trad wife of me, but I want to look my best for him, just like he looks his best for me. But the trouble is, I've never, ever enjoyed that vibe that seems to hang in the air at co-ed gyms. Some places have members that seem to care only about hooking up or ogling each other, while some female-only gyms are so underfunded that they just aren't worth going to. So, I took up hiking. I always figured the outdoors would be super good for my mental health, and I'd gone for walks in the woods as part of fighting off the postnatal depression, which were very effective at doing so. I remember how excited I was, driving out to a sporting goods store to pick up a snug pair of hiking boots, along with a lot of colorful waterproof gear, mostly in lilac, my favorite color. It felt like the start of something wonderful. But my first serious solo hike in the woods was set to be anything but relaxing or uplifting, and it left me with a greater respect for nature's wrath than I ever thought was possible. My husband and I arranged for him to look after the baby while I drove out to Olympic National Forest for an afternoon of hiking. All went swimmingly for about an hour or two, as I pushed myself up hills, feeling my thighs burning, then trembling when they felt the relief of a downslope. It felt amazing, exhilarating, truly uplifting, at least, until I took a tumble. I think my boot caught a rock or something, hidden among the earth. But whatever happened, I found myself rolling around in the dirt beneath me, holding on to my ankle as I grimaced in pain. I found I could still put a little weight on it, so it couldn't have been worse than a strain, but it still hurt like the devil. That's when the strangest, most adorable thing happened to me. A crow, a little cawing, black-feathered guy, flew down from a tree, landed on a tree stump nearby, and began to flap his wings. He was doing little jumps, flapping all the while, cawing his little head off like he was singing for his supper. He had seen me take a fall and was flying down to see if I was okay. I mean, that's what it seemed like, because as soon as I said, "Yeah, I'm fine, just scared myself is all," he quieted down and began eyeing me with each of the tiny black pebbles set into his skull. With my ankle still aching a little, I picked myself up, said goodbye to my new crow buddy, then began to limp back towards my car. What happened next seemed like the sweetest thing ever. My new little crow buddy actually followed me. Yep, he followed me, so close too, just making sure I was okay as I was shuffling back to my car. He flew from tree to tree, always sticking close, cawing every so often, just to let me know he was still there to watch over me. It honestly was such a boost. The fall had really rocked my confidence, and to know that nature had its own way of being so kind, so compassionate, it really picked me up at a time I absolutely needed it. However, it wasn't long until my ankle began to really swell up from the sprain, and obviously, with the swelling, came an increased amount of pain. Now, I know this might sound crazy, but that intense pain, and my inability to properly escape it, it brought back the memories of childbirth, and as I sat there on a fallen log, taking the weight off of my ankle, I found myself bursting into tears. And just like something out of a Disney movie, down swooped my little crow friend, who began his same little song and dance of concern. It made my heart swell at the time, it really did. It really was like Disney story or something, the crying princess and her little bird friend. But then, in what I thought was a beautiful moment, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Something was moving through trees about 100 yards up the slope. Something huge. Something that drooled when it saw me sitting on that fallen log. It was a grizzly bear, fresh out of hibernation, and it was starving. What I thought was my little crow friend began its song and dance again, only this time, it was intensely more frenzied than it had been before. I thought it was a warning. I couldn't have been more wrong. The bear began a rapid descent down the slope towards me, panting as it hurtled through the trees. But I was ready for it. I'd managed to pick up the most potent bear mace I could get my hands on, one of the things my new hiking buddies had insisted I purchase. I pulled it out, flipped off the safety catch, and sprayed a huge mist of bright yellow mace into the air in front of me. I was terrified, convinced that it just wouldn't work for some reason, that the bear would just be too damned hungry, would take the pain and tear me limb from limb right there on the forest floor. But it worked. It actually worked. As soon as the grizzly hit that stinging, yellow mist, it stopped dead in its tracks, blinking its eyes before it began to violently sneeze and retch as the mace began to take effect. I didn't bother to stick around and revel in the victory. I mean, who would? I just ran. Ran until my ankle felt like it was about to explode, but thankfully, some small act of God's mercy led me right back to my car, and somehow, I actually made it home. I lived to be able to tell this tale. But when I did a little research. What I thought was my little crow friend, what had seemed like a Disney-style friendship between Beauty and Beast, was anything but that. As it turns out, crows and bears have something of a special relationship. Often upon sighting a wounded or infirm animal, a crow will fly down from a tree and caw like the devil. Not out of any kind of concern, but in order to direct a large predator, often a bear, onto the wounded creature. Once the bear is finished chowing down, the crow can eat the scraps. And that day in the woods could have very well ended with me being the scraps. What you are about to read is a warning. I beg you, I implore you, please, do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I know those woods like the back of my hand. I was playing with my little brother among those trees when I was still in single-digit ages. So trust me when I say that something has been changing out there, and not for the better. I first noticed something was horribly wrong during a hike a few weeks back. In early spring, birds migrate back from the warmer, southern climates to their northern territories en masse. Thousands upon thousands of tiny songbirds occupied the trees around Mount Greylock during the month of March, each singing a sweet, chirpy song that is, in reality, a bellowed war cry, a call for challengers to step up and knock them off their perch. Yet, as I trudged through the previous winter's leaf litter, I couldn't hear a single thing. No birds, or any other animals for that matter, seemed to still call the forest home. This made me nervous for two reasons. One, animals have an uncanny ability to detect dangers that are imperceptible to humans. Their sense of smell, hearing, and general atmospherics are far superior to our own. If the wildlife had fled the area in such a hurry, or at least refused to return, that could mean something awful was about to happen. And two, areas of woodland turn exceptionally quiet when there is a large predator around. Wood pigeons will become deathly quiet and still, hoping a black bear or mountain lion will just pass them by. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but either way, it would be hideously unsafe of me to wander around while one was prowling the area. So naturally, I started making my way back towards my car, when something really peculiar happened. I feel I should remind you at this point that I'd been playing in the woods around Mount Greylock since I was like 7 or 8 years old. It's pretty far from where our family lived when I was a kid, but thanks to our bikes, we had a pretty large area to roam when it came to those long summer breaks. Point being, I know those woods really well, but some way, somehow, I managed to get lost. It first came to my attention that I'd managed to get myself turned around when I felt my head begin to throb with a dull ache. I stopped walking for a moment, rubbing my eyes and the bridge of my nose to try and massage away the ache. But when I opened my eyes again and looked around, I felt a faint flash of panic running through me. I did not recognize my surroundings, and I cannot understate how jarring that was for me. To be somewhere I'd been visiting all my life, only for it to feel utterly foreign to me. I actually had to take a moment to take out my compass, just to try and get a bearing of where I was headed. But to my surprise, the compass needle kept slowly moving around. Even when I got it to sit still on a supposed bearing, it slowly began creeping around again. Now, this was much less of a problem than it might appear. Sure, it was unnerving, but there are ways around a faulty compass. Like, for one, moss mostly grows on the north side of a tree, the side that gets the most sunlight. So that provided an easy way of determining which way was north. At least, it usually would. As I inspected various tree trunks, I realized the sun was hanging in the southern portion of the sky. That, or the moss in this area grew mostly on the south section of the tree trunks. I get that it's not entirely out of the question, but that was yet another detail that just seemed to fry my brain. Nothing made sense, and the less it did, the more the feeling of pure panic began to bubble up in my chest. But to panic in that situation, in any kind of situation, is to welcome defeat, degradation, and death. I kept myself calm, told myself there was a rational explanation for everything that was occurring, and walked off in the direction I was almost sure the nearest highway was. It was then I came across something I'd never, ever seen in those woods before. Something that seemed so out of place that it was frankly terrifying. In all the years I'd spent roaming those woods with my brother as a kid, I'd never seen anything like the old, run-down cabin that stood before me. And I mean it was old, as in there was no way it could have been built any later than like 1979. So just how me and my brother had missed this place was utterly beyond me. The obvious thing to do was to knock on the cabin door, see if anyone was home, and, as much as I might find it humiliating, ask for directions. But as I walked closer and closer towards the rustic front door, I felt the most unusual sensation. I put it down to general tiredness. Maybe my blood sugar was low. I'm not entirely sure. But for whatever reason, each footstep that took me closer to the cabin seemed more and more difficult. By the time I was actually bringing a closed fist up to knock on that old wooden door, it felt like something was physically repelling me from it, whispering directly into my brain, "Leave this place and never return. Don't look back. Never look back." When I finally knocked, the door creaked open slightly, revealing the dilapidation behind it. Whatever bolts or locks that were on the door had long since been worn away, and the inside was just as run down and rotten as the outside was. It was evidently abandoned, but there was a curious order to the furniture that led me to believe that, every so often, the cabin did actually receive some visitors, aside from me. But something in the corner of the cabin drew my attention. What drew my attention, what I'm about to attempt to describe, is, quite frankly, indescribable. I know it was a wooden idol of some kind. A small statuette sat atop a stone altar. But, and I appreciate this is intensely confusing to read, I could not make sense of what I was looking at. It was like my brain was completely incapable of computing the information my eyes were feeding it. And with that, my headache returned again, along with a kind of anxiety so crushing that I felt like I was going to have a panic attack. Don't ask me how I know, but that wooden idol, a mess of twigs and vines and moss, was a representation of pure, unfiltered evil. And I ran from it. I'm not in the least bit ashamed to admit that I ran like a scared child from that cabin. And into the night. The night. You read that right. When I walked into that cabin, it was still daylight. I couldn't have been there for more than a couple of minutes, at most. That's what it felt like. Only when I burst through that wooden door, it was pitch black outside. I ran until I found the highway, ran until I found my car, and drove like a madman until I was safely back home. I haven't been able to bring myself to talk about what happened to me that day, until now. I tried to tell a hunting buddy of mine once, but the words just wouldn't seem to come out. But please, if you're reading this, heed my warning, and do not go hiking in the woods around Pittsfield, Massachusetts. I grew up in a densely forested rural area in central Virginia, and like most kids my age, 10 at the time of this story, I spent a lot of time playing in and around the woods. My best friend and I had found a creek one day while exploring different deer trails through the woods. This creek we happened on was a very rare kind and the perfect spot for us to play. It was wide and deep enough to swim around in and had nice, soft, mossy banks on either side to rest on after we had tired ourselves out. The water was cool and clear, no copperheads, and no mosquitoes because the water was constantly running. We were psyched. After a few hours of swimming, we had to walk back home for lunch, but made plans to pack lunch the next day so we could have a picnic on the creek banks and spend the whole day there. The next morning we set out for the woods at around 1 p.m., planning to have the picnic first and swim after. We entered at the same spot we had the previous day and followed what we thought was the same deer trail. It was not. At the point where we should have found the creek, we walked into a small clearing that was covered in huge, thick ferns. We had definitely never walked past this before. So, being both hungry and tired of walking, we decided to eat in the clearing. We laughed and played around there for a while, spitting watermelon seeds at each other from our lunch. It was an absolute blast, and we were both in wonderful, giddy moods. That all changed, however, as soon as we packed up and set back out to find the creek. As we walked on, the woods started to feel darker and colder. We got skittish, and I noticed my friend kept whipping her head around to look behind us. After about a half hour of walking, we came up on what looked like an entire overgrown bathroom. Sink, toilet, and bathtub, all sitting arranged together and covered in ivy. It's pretty common to find weird stuff like this in the middle of the woods, so we just walked on and made jokes to lighten the mood, calling it Bigfoot's bathroom. After another hour of walking and not seeing anything we recognized, we started to panic. Instead of trying to reach the creek, we were now just trying to find our way back home, or out of the woods at least. I told her we should follow the sun and eventually we would come up on a road or someone's property where we could find help. She insisted on another way and we began yelling at each other out of fear and, let's be honest, little girl bossiness. I told her if she thought she was so right, she should just go her way and we would see who got out first, so we split up. Now, as an adult, I fully acknowledge I was being a stubborn brat, and also an idiot. Worst possible thing we could have done. Not 10 minutes after splitting up, I began to hear someone walking maybe 100 feet behind me. Thinking it was my friend deciding to go my way after all, I slowed down so she can catch up to me. Instead, whatever it was matched my pace. I slowed down, it slowed down. I stopped, it stopped. This went on for hours. The whole time I was going back and forth on whether or not it was in my head or there was really something following me. I picked up a big stick, swung it a few times to make sure it was sturdy if I had to hit someone, and trucked on. As it began to get dark, I came up on something that made my heart sink into my stomach. It was Bigfoot's bathroom. I had just walked in a huge circle, for hours, despite being 100% sure I was following the setting sun west the entire time. Confused and frustrated, I sat down on a log and just screamed my little heart out while smacking my stick repeatedly into the ground. As I tried to collect myself, I heard the footsteps again, walking up on me from behind. I called out my friend's name as loud as I could. No answer. Then, after a short pause, the steps began to run towards me. I jumped up and booked it as fast as I could in the opposite direction. Now, this is the truly horrifying part which I typically omit while telling people this story. As I was sprinting through the darkening woods, I began to hear what I thought were church bells. I looked up to see the darkest, deepest cloud I have ever seen in my life. In the middle, it was so black it was like looking into the night sky, and the dark gray around it seemed to be swirling. It gave me a horrible feeling to look at, almost like the nausea you get when looking through binoculars for too long. What sickened me further is that I realized the sound of the bells were coming through the hole in the cloud. They were deafeningly loud. I mean, really booming out of this thing. When I realized this, I stopped dead in my tracks. I felt a sense of absolute and overwhelming dread that has gone unmatched in all my 24 years on this planet. Something in my head began screaming that if I did not run away from whatever the hell that cloud was, no one would ever see me again. I would be gone. I did not want to run toward the thing chasing behind me either, though, so I made a sharp right and took off away from both. It was now completely dark, and I was running blind through the woods, smacking through branches, wheezing, and tripping every few feet for what seemed like another hour. Until I smacked into something low and flew over it, hitting the ground so hard all the air in my lungs was knocked out of me. As I lay there trying to recover, I realized I couldn't hear the bells anymore. Then my eyes adjusted more to the dark, and I realized what had just made me go head over heels was an old fence. Grabbing hold of it, I prayed it would lead me to a farm, and sure enough, it did. I walked up over a hill about a mile to the back of the farmhouse, explained what had happened, and the farmer graciously gave me a ride back home. I was covered head to toe in scrapes, oozing blood, and more exhausted than I had ever been in my life, but I was finally safe. It was past 9 p.m. when I finally walked through the front door. My friend had gotten back shortly after we split and figured I had as well, so hadn't told anybody I was lost, and my family just figured I was still out after dark, which wasn't uncommon for me at the time. They were shocked when I walked in beat up and crying. Nobody had been looking for me at all. To this day, I wonder how long they would have waited to come find me if I hadn't been lucky enough to find the fence, and if it would have been too late. Hey guys, glad to see you made it to the end of the video. Have you ever had a run-in with someone or something out in the deep woods? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. If you have any scary stories you'd like to be told, be sure to send them in. Alright guys, that just about wraps up the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So long, Fear Seekers. I'll see you in the next video.